And so just placing your awareness on the breath, noticing the rising and falling. And notice also, if you can, how it actually feels pleasant to breathe. And how pleasant it can be just to notice the breath. And underneath the breath, as we're aware of that motion, we might also notice a stillness, that we've allowed ourselves to sit in whatever other busyness is going on this weekend. We can still be seated in the middle of it. And our minds can settle a little bit too. We don't stop moving, just as even while you're seated, you don't stop moving. Maybe you're aware of sounds in your environment, or the sounds in my environment. My window's open and someone's got a wood chipper going. Maybe you hear that. And notice also that there's no obstruction among these things. All of these sights, sounds, feelings, they're all at once. And although we may only pay attention to one or two of them at a time, they don't obstruct each other in any way.
Let me try Chrome. I'm not sure what's going on with my browser or my video.
We hear you, Chris.
Okay. But you can't see me.
Cannot.
I don't know what's going on here.
You're invisible.
I felt that way my whole life.
I think we all have from time to time. And that's okay too.
Let me just see if that will work. I'll be right back. I got no clue. So anyway.
Well, we've been bound to have Zoom problems. It's worked effortlessly for all these past months. It's okay for it to have some trouble today. We all have good days, we all have bad days, but underneath, again, there's really no obstruction. The obstructions are in our minds. The bad days pass, the good days pass. And we can find that we're okay through both of them. We're okay whether or not our browser's working correctly, our video's working correctly. And we'll come back to this point, oddly enough, in a little bit.
Hey guys, welcome to another.
So taking 3 deep breaths. I'm going to close my window so that you don't have to hear the wood chipper outside. Well, welcome everyone. I see a few more people have been able to join us. That something went wrong with that link, so I apologize for that. So some of you know Dr. Dawn Sweet. She was a adjunct professor here at Iowa State for several years and is now at University of Idaho. And she is one of those people, when you hear about experts training the police how to detect liars, she's one of those people who can do that. So she's going to talk for a little while, and then I'm going to talk for a little while, and then we'll have some practice together to solidify some of the themes together. So Dr. Sweet, please, if you want to introduce yourself any more than that, you're welcome to, or launch right in.
I'm Dawn, and I just want to say thank you for inviting me today, and you gave me a reason finally to put on an actual piece of clothing rather than just sitting around in t-shirts and shorts all day. So I appreciate that. I think maybe more than the invitation. All right, so what I thought we would do, and Doug, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. So hopefully, okay, you may not be able to see me, but you could see my screen, yes?
Yes, yes indeed.
Okay, terrific. So like Doug mentioned earlier, what my area of expertise is nonverbal communication, and I'm interested in how our nonverbal behavior, how social cues, emotions interact with our environments, other people, and how these interactions will affect an interactional outcome, right? Are we going to have positive outcomes, negative outcomes, and to what extent is our behavior, our social cues having an influence on this? Oops. There we go. So I organized this talk today in three different contexts. I thought first we would talk a little bit about interpersonal perception and interpersonal communication. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the role bias has. And then we'll talk a little bit about nonverbal communication, and hopefully everything will hang together smoothly. So fingers crossed. Okay, so first thing I'd like to talk about is interpersonal communication. And a lot of people tend to work from the assumption that interpersonal communication is easy. The more we communicate, the better things get, when in reality, these myths are just that, they're myths. And we sometimes forget to take into account that communication is not just something that happens out there. It's also underpinned by our biology, by our physiology, and by underlying neurological processes. And a lot of this, all of these things, our biology, physiology, these neurological processes, they're all out of our conscious control. So what does this mean? Let's imagine for a moment that we're feeling fatigued and maybe a little irritated because we had a difficult or challenging day at work, and our physiological response to being fatigued, this may be a catalyst for being grumpy or impatient when we come home from a long day at work. So think about how you feel when you're fatigued. And you don't have any conscious control over how your body's feeling when it's fatigued. Your body just is. There's a reaction happening. So when we're feeling fatigued and we come home from work, we might be a little grumpy or irritable with the person we live with. Now, let's say on top of this long day at work, we had a quarrel with somebody from work. And we're angry still because we're continuing to replay this conversation, replay this argument over and over in our head. And think back to how you might feel when you're angry. You know, our anger, the anger response is underpinned by our biology. We're experiencing a hormone dump. We're getting a dump of adrenaline and noradrenaline. Our heart rate is increasing. Our breathing is faster. We're becoming tense. Our muscles are becoming tense. And so when your spouse or your family asks you how your day was, you're fatigued and you're angry and you bite their head off, right? So all of these underlying body-based responses are driving how you're interacting and talking with these people you care about. And so when we think about effective interpersonal communication, we need to take into account and be aware that an awareness of our bodies and how our bodies are reacting and interacting with social behavior is driving this. And our physiological and biological and neurological processes and these cognitions and emotions, they're all influencing how we perceive and make sense of social behavior and how we respond to the social behavior. Now, keep in mind, interpersonal communication is bidirectional, it's dynamic. It's about sharing, it's about creating shared meanings. But these meanings are being constructed based on the communication, which is being driven and underpinned by biology, physiology, and these neurological processes. And this brings me to the next talking point, which is the interpersonal perception process. So when we think about perception, perception is a process of making meaning from things that we observe, right? There's social cues in the world. We take them in and we make sense of them. And we're seemingly engaging in this interpersonal perception process constantly, and it's out of our conscious control. We're not really aware of what we're taking in, which cues we're taking in. And when we break down this interpersonal perception process, there's three prongs to it. There's three elements. There's selection, organization, and interpretation. And what I'd like to talk about first is selection. So rather than paying attention to all the stimuli in our environment, we engage in selection. We make decisions, choices about where we're going to attend, what we're going to attend to, what we're selecting. So this means that our minds and our bodies are helping us select the stimuli, because the selection process is driven by our senses. We see something, we hear something, we smell something, and that's directing our attention. That's directing us to select a particular stimulus or a set of stimuli from the environment. And it's important to remember here that we're not doing this consciously. It's stimulus response. Something is getting our attention. And when we're thinking about behavior, we have expectations about behavior, right? We think about behavior as being prescriptive. You know, this should happen in this situation. This ought to happen in this situation. And we don't tend to notice the social cues and the behaviors that are meeting our expectations, right? They become invisible. We don't pay attention to what we think should be there. But when there's been a deviation, when something different from what we expected is there, that's when we pay attention to it. So for example, we're more likely to select or attend to somebody talking loudly in the library or in a bookstore than someone talking loudly in the restaurant or in the bar or on the street. So again, we don't tend to notice that expected behavior. We notice what we perceive to be a deviation. And depending on the nature of that deviation, we can give it a positive or a negative valence. And then this assignment, this positive negative valence assignment, is going to determine how we proceed. I think in our next meeting, we'll talk a little bit more about this idea. But for now, I'd like you just to think about how this selection process, when we're selecting and attending to social cues, we're doing it non-consciously. We're not paying attention to it. It happens automatically. And then we have this immediate reaction, positive or negative. And then the next step in this perception process is organization. And this is where we're going to, take the stimuli, take the stimulus that we're selecting and attending to, and we're going to classify it. We're going to organize it. And we use these perceptual schemas to categorize information. And there's 4 different schemas that we use in this organization process. Physical constructs, right? So we'll notice something about somebody's height or weight or age or ethnicity and body shape. And then we put them in a category, right? Because you're this age, because you're this race, because you're this gender, right? You're gonna go here. Then we pay attention to roles. We take notice, what's somebody's role? Are they a professional? Are they maybe a teacher? Are they a doctor? Are they a police officer? Are they a protester? So we notice something about their physical makeup. Then we take note of what their role might be. And then we look at these interaction constructs. So for example, people's behavior. We might notice something about someone's personality. And we're going to organize around that. Well, this person is shy, this person is aggressive, this person is combative, this person is docile. And then we layer in psychological constructs. We start thinking about their thoughts or their feelings. And remember, this is all happening non-consciously. Because you're this age, race, weight, this is how you look, this is what role I think you are. This is something about how you're interacting in a way that's aggressive or combative or docile. So you must be feeling this, you must be thinking this. And we're making these decisions in the blink of an eye. So there's this element of thin slicing, right? So that comes out of the work of Nalini Ambady. She was a very well-known social psychologist. I think she was at Stanford. And she talks about how we take in snippets of behavior and we make decisions in the blink of an eye about this. And then this leads us into this interpretation category where we as humans, we want to make sense of things, right? Because I perceive you to be X, Y, and Z, because I'm putting you into one of these 4 categories, you must be this. This must mean that. So this is that final stage. And, we're going from selection to interpretation very, very quickly. And, so if you think back, I like to use this example with my students. So think back to when you were in junior high school and you had a crush on that cute boy or that cute girl. And you see the cute boy or cute girl walking in the hallway and this person smiles at you and says, hi. What do? We go to a friend and we say, oh, Bobby smiled and said hi. Susie smiled and said hi. What do you think that means? Do you think they like me? Right? So we try to make sense of these social cues. And, again, this is happening in the blink of an eye. And we're in this near constant state of trying to take in and organize and interpret stimuli from the social world. And our minds are working to organize and interpret so quickly that we are lulled into this false belief that these perceptions are objective, that they're in some way factual reflections of the world, when in reality they're not. They're just our subjective interpretations of the world. And so, getting along in the social world depends a great deal on our ability to make meaning out of other people's behaviors. And when we talk about this sense-making process, we're talking about perception. Our minds and our senses help us understand the world around us, but our minds and perceptions also lead us to make mistakes or misinterpret elements of people's behavior. And so I think if we try to slow this process down, if we try to slow this automatic process down, the better we may be able to understand something about ourselves and another person, and the more likely we could be able to have more positive interactions with others. And something else to think about is, in this process, while we are going through the paces of selecting and organizing and interpreting, other people are doing that about us. Right? So remember, communication is a two-way street. It's bidirectional, it's dynamic. What this person is doing is influencing what you're doing, and what you're doing is influencing what this person is doing. So as we're making these snap decisions and judgments about others, as we're quickly classifying and interpreting behavior, people are doing the same thing about us, about our social cues. So I just want to stop here for a moment and ask if anyone has any thoughts or comments or questions about anything so far.
I do, Dawn. Like sometimes it seems we purposely do, screen out things in our environment, but sometimes we attend. So is selection always unconscious? I mean, are you talking about certain? You see, I'm asking, like, sometimes we purposefully attend, right?
Sure.
So what's what is the domain that you're talking about right now? I guess I just want to get a little hands on that.
Okay. So, I mean, certainly we have covert attention and overt attention, right? Where we're intentionally attending to something because maybe we have a goal, right? I need to go into the store and get this item, and I need to pay attention to what's going to be the fastest route to get in or get out, right? I need to go to the PTA meeting, and I want to avoid Mrs. and Mr. Smith, so I want to know where they are and try to circumvent them. So, there's also a strategy to communication, right? It's goal-directed. Our interactions tend to be goal-directed. So it sounds like what you're getting at is whether or not there's a difference between these goal-directed interactions and then these other interactions where we just let happen and let unfold over time. Yeah, so I think it's just that I think it's, do you have a goal? Are you moving with purpose through the world? Are you specifically looking for things, or are you just interacting and moving through your day? And I don't want to say drifting, because that might be negatively charged, but sometimes we do just drift through our day, and then we notice things and we quickly go from 0 to 60, from selection to interpretation, and we may not have the full scope of the picture.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay. And any other thoughts or comments?
Well, I have a question. So when does the labeling of positive and negative, which step in the process, or it or all of them, or whatever, and then is there a neutral?
Okay, so so technically, when we're talking about emotion, surprise is the only neutral emotion, right? It's a response to a stimulus, and then we do some sort of appraisal. We think, okay, well, did I like that? Did I not like that? When we're talking about assigning valence, it's whatever, it's going to come from that visceral reaction, right? So maybe you're meeting a friend for coffee at Starbucks, let's say. And, you know, people tend to be a little chatty when they're sitting having coffee in Starbucks, but there tends to be a sense of what's an appropriate volume. And then if people next to you are talking loudly, you're going to notice that, and then you're likely going to assign a negative valence to that because it's an expectancy violation.
So Dawn, would the things that you're not, that are going as expected, so you're not attending to, would that not be neutral?
That would be neutral because it's not in your field of vision, or it's not in the scope of your attention.
You're not caring about it enough to really attend to it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. So thanks for offering that. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a good point.
You know, and then certainly if there's a deviation, you know, that's positive, that brings a smile to your face, right? I mean, maybe somebody at work got a new puppy, and, you know, we don't typically bring puppies to work, but this day your coworker brought a puppy, and oh, look, there's a puppy, and that makes you smile and that makes you happy, right? You know, but assuming you're a dog person. If you're not, you know, the person brings their new kitten. So it's that visceral reaction, and we don't think about it, right? We just go from zero, you know, stimulus response. When we talk about emotion, we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
I have a question. These responses, you know, when you say visceral, it sounds almost as if it's unintentional, kind of instinctive. I don't know what a better word, but they change throughout life, right? Because if somebody were to bring their newborn baby to workplace before I had a child, I might be irritated because it's noise. If somebody brings their newborn baby after I had children, I'm like, oh, because I have the same one at home. And then if somebody brings a newborn baby now and mine are older, I'm happy because it's not my newborn baby.
Right.
And so it's, you know, they change, right? And they change with our experience. So if they change with our experience, does it mean that the initial ones are shaped by our upbringing? Before we experience something for the first time, do we form some kind of expectation of what to expect? And then that kind of shapes our initial response too.
Yeah, absolutely. These impressions that we're forming of other people, these impressions of experiences we're having, they could evolve, and you know, they're changeable, right? When we talk about first impressions, certainly they're powerful and they're important, but they're changeable, right? That they could transform over time. And you know, what you were talking about earlier with bringing a newborn, it's like you said, it's perspective, it's experience. So now I have this shared experience, right? I know what it's like to have a newborn. So now I feel sorry for this poor person who's bringing their child to work. You know, they may not have childcare, or, you know, there might be these other reasons around why this newborn is coming to work. So now we have empathy because we're able to take, or have perspective because we have that shared experience. And, you know, it evolves, right? And, you know, your kids are older now and you're thinking, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to deal with that anymore. And then you can sit back and smile and say, oh, I remember when. And then, right, it changes how you approach and interact and make sense of this person's behavior. So if this person comes to work, you know, grumpy or cranky, or, you know, fatigued, you have some context now for understanding, right? So context is important also. You know.
I have a small follow-up because as a teacher, often when I read about student perceptions of teachers, I very commonly came across the line that the student's expectation or the student's opinion is formed within the first 5 minutes of the first lecture, and it doesn't really change. And I'm thinking, really? It doesn't change throughout the remaining 16 weeks? That seems strange.
There was so earlier I mentioned Nalini Ambati, and she published the paper a number of years ago where she was looking at students' evaluations of teachers. And what she and her colleagues did was present students with, I think it was 1 second clip, 3 second clip, and a 5 second clip. I mean, Doug, if you're familiar with it, you know, please correct me, but it was very short video clips, you know, 1 second, 3 second, 5 seconds. And then she had the students rate the teacher based on, you know, how likable this person is, how effective, how good they are at their job. And then she had those data. And then at the end of the semester, she took the students' evaluations, and there was a strong correlation between, you know, if I rated you positively, even after a 1 second video clip, if I rated you positively, I'm going to rate you positively later in the semester. Now, that's not to say that, you know, every single person is going to, you know, stand by their initial impression, because, you know, invariably, you know, you're a teacher, you know, there's going to be that one person who doesn't like you by the end of the semester, and they're going to say horrible things about you. But there is a really good correlation between initial impressions, not only in teaching, but also in human resources, in interviewing. She also did a study looking at interviews, employees interviewing for positions. And it was a similar design where she just showed short clips of interviews, and the interviewer had the same impression of the person. So, I mean, that's the power of first impressions. You know, if you're interested in reading more, you know, I could share some information. I can share some information with Doug, and he could distribute to the group. And Malcolm Gladwell, he actually popularized that work in thin slicing a number of years ago. He published a book called Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And he talks about different examples of, or different contexts for making these snap decisions. You know, and there's just a huge body of research on that. And it's driven by social cues, right? So, you know, oh, I forgot to show you my funny pictures here of taking in the information, right? We see a mop, and then we see an angry mop, and then an angry person. But I wanted to get to the next slide, because we're talking about downstream effects now, right? We're talking about bias. I'm talking about this, about the primacy effect, where you know, these first impressions are so strong, so powerful. It could take a lot potentially to move us off those marks. There was a study done, I think the researcher's name was Sol, S-O-L, and he presented people with a list of adjectives: intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. So there's a couple of positive words, intelligent and industrious, and then there's negative words that follow. Folks who were described like this had more positive ratings. Then he presented the same list of words, but he reversed that serial ordering and began with the negative, and then these folks were rated more negatively because he was priming them on the front ends with the negative, right? And it's a little bit, I don't know, I mean, it's challenging. Once we have a negative impression of somebody, it can be difficult to move off that mark. Not impossible, but difficult. And you know, so one of the effects, or one of the implications or consequences of this person perception process is, you know, leading us to make potentially biased decisions or judgments. And, you know, I want to point out that I gave a very, very brief description of the person perception process. I mean, there's a lot more to it. In the interest of time, I just wanted to give us a couple of talking points to think about. But I have more information on that too I could share. Yeah, I didn't want to talk for too long today. You know, and so this primacy effect is a really, you know, salient bias for interaction. You know, we're going to remember our first impressions of people more than we'll remember our second or third or fourth impressions of people. And remember that they're not necessarily permanent. We just need to be aware of, okay, you know, I have this impression, but what's behind this impression? What's informing the impression. Other questions, comments, thoughts? You know, so if we're not, I guess one of the points I wanted to make here is if we're not aware of which social cues and the categorizations of them we're using to inform impressions and judgments of others, that's when we run the risk of being biased, right? So this primacy effect, it just, like I said before, it means that first impressions are powerful, but they're not unchangeable, right? We can move off these marks. You know, it depends, you know, a lot of it is framing, right? So what you were talking about earlier with bringing the newborn to work, it's how we're framing this. So I observe this in this situation, I can frame it, you know, as someone who doesn't have kids, I can frame it as, oh my God, what a disaster. What are you thinking bringing a you know, 6-week-old infant to work? You know, put a different frame around it. Wow, you know, it's good that you're able to bring this child to work and care for it while getting your job done. And, you know, maybe instead of, you know, cursing the crying baby, maybe I could offer to hold the crying baby, right? So it's how we frame situations as well. So, you know, that's that appraisal. How am I going to look at this situation? You know, so context there. And then the other bias I wanted to introduce is this idea of confirmation bias, where when we have these social cues that might be ambiguous in some way, we may have a tendency to interpret these ambiguous cues in a way that already support our belief, right? So we're going to have these pre-existing beliefs. So if we think back to this person perception process, you see a young Black male with his pants below his butt, a ball cap sideways. You know, you might be inclined to interpret that or perceive that in a negative way, and you're going to see the negative potentially there, right? There's going to be some sort of stereotype activation. But you may not see that, well, this young Black guy with the baggy pants and sideways ball cap, well, what is he doing? Oh, he's helping hand out groceries, you know, with the Red Cross people, or he's helping fill sandbags because the levee is going to break, right? So we default so quickly that we, you know, sometimes fail to put another frame around things. And we sometimes fail to take a step back and say, okay, here's this initial impression. Here's how I got, you know, here's why I think this, but what else could it be? You know, and we're all human. We all have biases. It doesn't make us bad people, right? It only makes us bad people if we aren't aware of them, and if we don't try to, you know, grapple with or understand, well, where is this coming from? What am I paying attention to? How am I framing this? You know, what are the social cues I'm taking in? Other comments, questions?
Don, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this is Chris. Hey, thanks so much for being here. I guess from the biological standpoint, and I guess a Darwinistic perspective, probably, or I'm just going to proceed from this premise that, you know, these sort of perception processes develop because those that develop them out-survive those who did not. And probably they serve some sort of purpose, this, I guess, just to call it generalization and categorization that we do on the snap in the moment, probably for our safety. Mm-hmm. And of course, at some point, you know, every generalization becomes a lie, I think, you know, if you break it down far enough, whether it's a particular person or a group or members of a group. So when I have that going on, I mean, other than just trying to acknowledge that, is there anything else I can do to prevent that from happening, I guess is the word? Because I know I've certainly gotten in trouble making these generalizations before. And that's doing the best I can not to. So.
Yeah. I think, Chris, you made a really good point about that there was this biological component, right? So there is this survival utility, if you will, for assessing danger, right? So if I've had one too many beers on a Friday night, am I going to take the shortcut through the alley where I'm hearing noises, or am I going to walk to the corner? Right. So there is this survival self-presentation. Fear and anger could be adaptive responses when we're put under threat. Right. And there certainly are people out there who might pose a threat to us. But in everyday, ordinary interactions, that threat, at least the threat for physical well-being, is likely pretty low. And so, getting to your question about what you could do is, I would pay attention to what are you paying attention to? What is informing this decision? How did I get from, 0 to 60? Where is it coming from? What previous experience have I had? What previous experiences have I had to help me get from here, that prompted me to get from here to there? I think it's just about being self-aware and understanding that origin of that thinking, of those decisions.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Doug, do you have any thoughts?
Well, let's finish your bit.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's hard because what we're talking about is these automatic processes. We go through the world, to some extent on autopilot. Think about how exhausting, think about how time consuming it would be if you had to deliberate over every single decision you make throughout the day, right? So there is a sense that these heuristic models that we follow. In this situation, here's what I would expect to happen, right? When this doesn't happen in this situation, well, now my spidey senses are tingling, right? Now I'm alert, now I'm aware, now I'm starting to assess. So we do rely a lot on these, mental frameworks and heuristic models of, I know what to do in this situation, right? But when you get in your car, you probably don't even think about all the little steps you go through when you get in your car, start it, pull out, and drive. And it's the same when we're interacting with people. And when we see something that deviates from what we would expect, that's when we alert, because maybe it's a survival instinct kicking in. Is this something I need to pay attention to? Is this something that I'm perceiving in a positive way, in a negative way? And so why is it? Like, why is it, do we get angry with the person at Starbucks who's talking too loudly? Right? Why is it we get angry when we see, somebody being mistreated? Why is it we don't get angry when we're seeing somebody being mistreated? Right? So where are these decisions coming from? And, that's, it's something that I think we all probably need to engage with a little bit more, right? Not to be finger wagging and trying to tell folks what to do, but I think if we work on understanding where these perceptions and judgments are coming from, where are the social cues, then we can take steps to mitigate whatever these downstream effects might be. And so that brings me to the next point I wanted to talk about is, these automatic cognitive processes and that are part of nonverbal communication. And when we think about behavior, when we talk about nonverbal behavior in particular, it's a continuum, right? We have what we call this preconscious automaticity. Then we have this midpoint where it's goal directed. And then we have this control point on the spectrum. And in this, on the first anchor point, this preconscious automaticity, this is when things are happening bang, bang, right? There's stimulus response. You're thinking about it in a way that is non-conscious. It's not in your conscious control. It's not in conscious awareness. You see something, you have some sort of visceral reaction, you have some sort of body-based response to it. And your response is going to be out of your conscious control. And I have a little video to demonstrate this. So here we go. It's a video clip of a little baby listening to his mother blow her nose. Oops. So you could see from that, hopefully, how there's this range of emotion, right? So when we take in stimuli, we're going through a range of emotions, reactions, a range of feelings, and we're not really thinking about them. We may not be in control of them. So you have this pre-verbal infant who, doesn't have the language skills yet, or the logic skills, the intellectual capacity to go through those paces of, oh, mom is blowing her nose. That's funny. I'm going to laugh. Mom is blowing her nose. That's scary. I'm going to look afraid. No, it's stimulus response. And so a lot of what we're doing is happening out of our conscious control. So let's say for a moment, we're walking down the street and we see something, we see some social cues, some behaviors we don't like, and we have some sort of automatic response to that. Maybe we give the person a dirty look and we're not aware of it. And then the person says something to us. And suddenly we've gone from walking down the street to now getting into a potential verbal altercation because we gave some social cue, right? And what are we thinking? I didn't do anything. Why are you looking at me like that? Why are you talking to me like that? I didn't do anything. It's you. So we have to understand that, when things go sideways in interaction, we do have a role in it. And again, it's because we're not always consciously aware or consciously able to control what our reactions are going to be. Oops, I keep clicking on the wrong thing. Okay, so the next part of this is this midpoint. It's the goal-directed automaticity. And in the literature, sometimes this is talked about masking behavior. Sometimes this is talked about display rules, where we become aware of something we're feeling or thinking. And then as we become aware of how we're reacting, we try to stop that process, slow it down, and control what's going on. So think about a time when maybe you got a really awful, horrible birthday gift and you didn't like it. But what do? We look at this horrible, awful birthday gift and we're thinking, well, this is the worst thing I've ever seen, but we have to smile. Say, oh, thanks, Grandma. I love the pink sweater with the pom-poms on it. Right? So we have to shut down that automatic process and engage in this goal-directed behavior. I want Grandma to continue to like me. I want to be polite and respectful to Grandma. So I'm going to smile and say it's great, even though I really want to roll my eyes or make a horrible face. So we have an awareness of, what's warranted in a particular situation. So this doesn't mean that we're not entitled to having whatever feelings we're having. It just means we have them, and then we try to alter our visible behavior. So I have another video clip.
One of them is about to become the new Miss USA.
So pay attention to Miss Virginia.
Runner-up is Virginia.
Okay, so that got away from me for a moment. So a beauty pageant, right? So you have 50 women, and then these are the 3 prettiest women in all the land. And let's go back and watch it again and pay attention to Miss Virginia, right? What's the expectation? We should all be smiling. We should all be happy. And then do you notice anything about Miss Virginia's facial expressions?
One of them is about to become the new Miss USA. The second runner-up is Virginia.
So did you catch anything about Miss Virginia, about what she was doing? Okay, so Miss Virginia, she wasn't happy being voted, I guess, second runner-up is the third prettiest gal in all the land. She wasn't happy with that. So she had a look of contempt on her face. And then she tried to mask it with a smile. And that contempt turned into disgust. So that's that goal-directed component, right? I feel unhappy. I feel contempt or disgust about something, but I try to cover it up. She didn't do a very good job of it, but it's the idea of, trying to manage these negative feelings that would not be socially appropriate in a particular in this particular situation. Okay, then let's talk about the last part of this. This is the controlled, and in the controlled part, with the controlled side of the spectrum, it's about us being aware and acting in a way that's intentional, right? It takes a tremendous amount of cognitive effort. Let's say you want to ask your boss for a raise. You don't like your boss. So you have to, shut down the pre-conscious stuff. You have to go even beyond the goal-directed, and you have to completely control everything about how you're self-presenting, everything about what you're saying, how you're acting. And I have a really cheesy video of this. Let's see if you recognize who the person in the video is. It's totally cheesy, but this is a really good example of what that controlled, I really have to act a particular way.
Tell you about the Aren't You Hungry for a Whopper game at Burger King. You can win a Whopper or a Coke, 1,000, 5,000, even $1 million. There's a win in 6 chance of winning a prize. Okay, back to the most important reason to come to Burger King, the food.
Okay, so totally cheesy video, but you get the sense of the control. No one is ever that happy about a Whopper, right? Unless maybe the people from The Walking Dead and they find some Whoppers on the ground. So that's where you're really working hard to intentionally send a message. Did anybody recognize her? No. Meg Ryan, before she was Meg Ryan. So she was selling Whoppers. Okay, so questions or comments about this continuum of automaticity? No? Okay, so let's press on to the final part of this, of our time or of my time with you. And we'll talk a little bit about nonverbal communication, some of the channels. Okay, so our bodies do in fact tend to be somewhat leaky, right? What that means is, because of this continuum of automaticity, because of that pre-conscious automaticity side of it, it can be really challenging sometimes to hide what we're feeling, what we're thinking. We might think we're doing a good job, but what happens is, as our cognitive load goes up, it diminishes our ability to control certain aspects of our behavior. And what further complicates this is that with communication, there's this ongoing tension between, what's the message I'm intending to send, but what's the message I'm perceiving. So when we look at these two images, you have, Jeff. So this is another colleague, a friend of mine, Jeff Thompson. He's a detective with the New York City Police Department. So you have Jeff sitting with his face in his hand, then you have Jeff sitting with his hands in this quasi-steeple position. When you look at these two images, what are your thoughts? How do you make sense of Jeff's behavior? How do you interpret it?
Bored or interested?
Yeah.
Doug?
Bored or interested?
Bored or disinterested? Bored or interested. Okay, Sue, what were you going to say?
Yeah, bored, disbelieving, like, really, I'm supposed to believe that, kind of on the left, and tell me more on the right.
Okay.
That's funny because I
Yeah.
feel the left image is paying attention and observing, and the right image is thinking about something, trying to solve a puzzle.
Oh, I saw the left as tired. He's tired. I don't think bored. But the slump of his shoulders, maybe discouraged. And then the other one, he's kind of perking up, thinking things through.
So did you, it sounds like most people had a negative interpretation first and then a positive. It could also be he has a toothache, right? It could also be, maybe he's stifling a burp, right? Not to be crass. So it's tricky, right? When it comes to behavior, it's really tricky because all of us here are looking at the same two images, but we all got to a different interpretation. We all, we thought similar things, but we all, also thought some different things. And that's the danger of nonverbal communication, of these social cues, right? How do we know what's the right interpretation of this? So there's this challenge there. Now, remember, earlier I had said, as we are selecting and organizing and interpreting when we're interacting with other people are doing that with us. So we are also a source of information. We are also a set of stimuli for folks. And so much of what we're doing, it's just not in our conscious control, right? When we become aware, right? So if you're suddenly sitting, with your arm like this, and you start thinking, oh, I wonder if they think I'm bored. I wonder if, I better sit up straight, right? Then we start to make adjustments. And, for those of us who teach, how many times in class do we see students slumping in their seats? And we're thinking, oh, okay, I better start to be more entertaining, more energetic, more lively, right? I need to do something to draw this person out. Well, it could just be the kid has a bad back and that's a comfortable way for the person to sit, right? So one way, to combat that, that's a confirmation bias. It's an ambiguous cue. When I see you slouching, I think you're bored or disinterested. I don't think it could be anything else, so I'm going to approach this now with something negative in mind. Now this conversation is going to have a more negative tone or tenor to it. With our gross bodies, we have we have three different body planes. We have our sagittal plane that's going to cut us in half long ways, right? That comes from the sagittal plate in our head. We turn right, we turn left. We could move this way, we can move that way. Then we have the transverse plane that cuts us in half right about around the hips, and above the hips is the superior and below the hips is inferior. Then we have the transverse, what's in front of us and back of us. And think about how we use our bodies to show we're paying attention, right? Where our interest is, how we're engaged. So imagine a conversation with somebody you don't like. And instead of perhaps leaning forward and nodding, tell me more, you suddenly find yourself leaning back, and now you're oriented this way, and they're not even in that frame of dominant orientation, right? So that frame of dominant orientation is driven by our hips. Where your hips go, that's where your attention is. And so when we like somebody, when we're engaged, when we're interested, we tend to align our hips with whatever that other stimulus is. When we don't like people, when we don't want to be in a particular situation, non-consciously, what do? We find ourselves rotating away, turning away from that encounter. Think about when you're having a conversation with somebody and the person starts to turn their head ever so slightly to the right or to the left. It doesn't take a whole lot of twerking left or right to make us feel, or to prompt us to feel like this person's not paying attention to us. When we think about the range of motion, we have roughly 90 degrees. When our heads are in a neutral position, the tip of our chins, when the tip of our chins are aligned with our suprasternal notch, that's that little horseshoe bone right here, we have 90 degrees range of motion, you know, if you're limber, termed that far. We only have to go about 30 degrees left or right before somebody feels like we're not paying attention to them. So imagine if I spent most of our time together talking like this. You would probably wonder what interesting thing is over here, right? Nothing, just my door, right? So we're very, very sensitive to how people are communicating to us with our bodies. Am I this way? Am I this way? So again, when sometimes we become aware of it and we make adjustments, we make alterations, but it doesn't take a whole lot of movement one way or the other to signal I'm disengaged. Okay, now, why is this important? Well, we've already covered this a little bit, you know, engagement, interest, etc. And I have another video for us to watch. It's the video from Ann Curry's last day on the Today Show. So you may remember a few years ago, Ann Curry was suddenly dismissed as in her role on the Today Show. And there were conversations around whether or not Matt Lauer had something to do with it, and Matt Lauer and Ann Curry don't get along. And of course, now we know all about Matt Lauer and what he's been up to in his career. And so this video clip has Al Roker and Ann Curry and Matt Lauer and Natalie Morales sitting on a couch. And I want you to pay attention to what Ann Curry does with her body when Matt Lauer tries to hug her. Here we go.
In the near future, and you'll be with us at the Olympics, which we're looking forward to. And most importantly, you've made us better, and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We'll be back to the local
So did it look like Ann Curry was too keen to have Matt Lauer come at her and try to hug her? No, but she was okay with Al Roker. She was okay with Natalie Morales. And how do we know this? Because of what she was doing with these different body planes, right? So people will signal, and a lot of that signaling is non-conscious. I'm sure she wasn't consciously thinking, oh, let me try to shrink away from him. It was just a reaction, right? And then she probably figured people were noticing this, and then she stopped what she was doing. So that's the power of this non-conscious component of communication. The next channel I'd like to talk about is voice. We have these two dimensions in communication. We have the content, that's what we're saying, the words we're using. Then we have the relational. That's what we're saying without saying it, right? So content, relational, what we're saying and how we're saying it. So for those of you who have kids, you may have said a time or two to your son or daughter, don't take that tone to me. Don't talk to me like that. We're not really taking issue so much with the words, but how the words are coming out of their mouth. So we might not like our boss, let's say, and we might think when we're talking with our boss, we're sounding like everything is fine, but there's this relational component, right? There's this prosody in our voice, there's this edge, and we're short and we're abrupt with our boss. It's that emotion that's coming out. And we're not always we're hardly ever consciously aware of that, because we might be too busy trying to make sure we're smiling, trying to make sure we look like we're paying attention, but we might overlook the voice. And when someone asks us a question, we might say, yes, okay, fine, good. And we may not even be aware of what we're signaling, with this relational part of our voice. The last part, or the last channel I'd like to talk about is gaze, eye behavior. If you go back to first principles, we don't look at something if we don't like it, right? I mean, there are some exceptions. You might see a dead deer on the side of the road, you're drawn to it. But generally speaking, if we don't like something, If we don't like a person, we're not going to look at that person. Think about what this means for relationships. There might be people at work who you don't like, but you're forced to work with them. And you're in a group meeting and you find yourself, you might become aware that you're making eye contact or you're looking at everybody except this one person who you don't like. Right? Then we get to that goal directed. Okay, well, now I need to make sure I'm going to look at this person, right? I'm catching myself not looking at this person. Now I need to make eye contact. So again, it's this, it's the non-conscious element of nonverbal communication. And think how something like not looking at somebody in a group meeting, think about how that could send this particular interaction down an unintended path. Because it's likely other people are noticing you're not looking at this person you're looking at. And it becomes this disruptive component to this meeting. And certainly when we don't like people, we don't want to look at them, because any type of gaze, it's an invitation to intimacy. It's an acknowledgement of, I see you, I recognize you, you're another person, you exist in time and space. And we don't want to give that to people we don't like. So it's being aware of not only what the other person is doing, but be aware of what we're doing. Right? How could we try to, stop the leaks with our own nonverbal communication? And just to sum up real quickly, I guess the things I'd like you to walk away from this conversation is remembering our, communication. It's about making meaning, but it's not just what's happening out there. There is this physiological and biological component. There's these neurological processes, cognitions, affect, emotion, the perceptions we have of others often occur non-consciously. And we do go from selection to interpretation pretty quickly. So let's think about, what are we paying attention to? Is there another way to frame this, to think about it? Because so much of what we're doing is out of our conscious control. And it's that two-way street. We're making judgments about others, and they're doing that with us. So questions, and I have homework for you guys, but questions or comments?
Before we do questions, let's do a little practice, if you're okay with that, Dawn.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So I'd like people to take a meditative seat. Maybe, Dawn, if you'll stop your sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know I was, there we go.
Great. So if people would take a meditative seat, and we're going to do this in 4 parts. So we'll just start with kind of settling into the breath and clearing a little space. We've gotten lots of good information, and let's just let it rest and not puzzle over it quite yet. We'll work with it in a few minutes. Just feeling the body and perhaps noticing its position in the 3 planes. Noticing the movement and the stillness combined. Noticing perhaps the space between the thoughts, and allowing that space to stretch. And as Dawn noted, many of these things are very fast moving. They happen outside of our conscious awareness, but they don't always have to. And part of the value of a meditation practice is that it can help us to see these processes in finer and finer detail, to help slow them down so they don't move quite so quickly. So if it feels okay to you, I'd like you to close your eyes, and I'd like you to recall a time when someone surprised you by understanding your mood better than you did. When they noticed something about you and you hadn't yet even realized it for yourself. Maybe you came home and they said, "What's wrong?" And you said, "Nothing." And you said, "Really? Seems like you're upset about something." And as you paid better attention, you realized they were right. So find a memory of one of these times. And then see if you can figure out what cues they were picking up. What is it that was leaking out of you that they noticed? You tell yourself that story from your perspective and then try to shift over to their perspective. To what were they seeing when they looked at you? Was it about your posture? Was it something on your face? Was it in the way you were moving or the way you weren't moving?
That was great.
And now I'd like you to shift and think of a time when you noticed someone else's mood and surprised them by understanding them better than they were aware at that moment. What was it you were paying attention to? What did you notice? Do you even know what you were noticing in that moment? Was it that something changed in their demeanor or the slump of their shoulders or how they were reacting to what you were saying wasn't the way you expected, and that made you pay better attention to how they were attending to the world? What is it you could tell that they didn't yet know? And finally, I'd like you to think of a time in the recent past few weeks, that was difficult for you, when you were having a difficult time with another person or a situation. Maybe you were upset or angry or disappointed. Bring to mind some of the specifics of what it was that was upsetting you at that time or frustrating you. And if it feels okay, allow yourself to feel a little of that feeling. Let it build up perhaps in your chest or your head or your hands or wherever you feel it. When you feel that sense of anger or disappointment, difficulty. And now thinking about the situation that you were in, see if you can notice how narrow your attention became. When you were in this difficult situation, feeling these difficult feelings, what could you pay attention to? What were you so focused on in that situation? How does the scope of your attention feel when you're having these difficult emotions? Do you become hypersensitive to certain things and insensitive to other things? Does your attention focus more outside of yourself or inside of yourself? Can you notice what a pleasant day it is when you're angry at someone? And now allowing the visualization and your memories to relax and come back to where you are now and how you feel now. And what a lovely day it is. And taking 3 deep breaths, releasing any tension that's built up. Feeling the general okayness that's there underneath, even as we bring difficult feelings to mind. So before we move into general questions for Dr. Sweet and conversation about your experience with this, I'm going to once again ask if I'm going to post this video again for people who weren't able to make it. So if any of you don't want me to include you in it, send me a private message just to let me know that. And so what came up for you in that meditation, or what what thoughts or questions do you have for Dr. Sweet?
Can I ask a question about a couple slides ago before we go to the meditation reflection?
Sure.
You were talking about eye gaze, eye contact, I presume, to some extent. And my question is that I discovered a long time ago when I was in high school that it is very difficult for me to maintain eye contact when I'm trying to formulate thoughts or answer questions. And then later, of course, I found out that it's preferable to maintain eye contact, to look engaged and paying attention. And ever since then, I've been at this conflict of what am I supposed to do? Because if I look at the person's face, I'm distracted. I start examining the face and the eyes and the eyelashes and the brows and the nose and everything else. And it's so hard to formulate my thoughts. So in fact, apparently in Ukraine in high school, you take oral exams, and I had an oral exam in Ukrainian literature. And while giving my answer on the piece of literature I read, I looked into the window. And apparently that offended one of the examiners, who complained about my rude behavior afterwards. And so ever since then, I settled on something like looking somewhere around the ear area, so it's close to the face. But if I try to look directly into the eyes, and it's not sort of an intimate like situation, I find it just very hard to think about what I'm trying to say. And I don't know if that's part of kind of a neurological slight dysfunction, or because I have attention issues, or it's just that's the way it's supposed to be. And what is that professional engaged eye contact?
So there's 4 functions of gaze. One of them is cognitive. And what happens is when we're under heavy cognitive load, like trying to remember questions for a test, or we're having a conversation with somebody and we're trying to think about how to say something, what to say, it's actually considered normal to avert our gaze, to look away, because by looking away, we lower our cognitive load because we're not taking in all the stimuli that person is signaling. And in two-person conversations, there's it's called turn taking. And the pattern is when the person who has the floor, the person who's speaking in a two-person conversation, makes less sustained direct eye contact because cognitive load, trying to think about what they're saying. The listener makes more sustained is looking because they're trying to follow along. And that gets into conversations with deception, right? So we have reflexive questions and reflective questions. Reflexive questions, what's your name? Where are you from? What did you have for breakfast on Thanksgiving morning in 2010? Oh, I have to look away. And so there's this assumption that when I'm looking away, or when someone's looking away, they're being dishonest or being shady in some way, when really all it means is there's some sort of cognitive load. The person is under load and they're trying to think or recall information. Now, it could mean they're lying. It could also mean they're not. Liars actually make more direct sustained eye contact. But to look away in situations where we're under load and trying to communicate, that's a normal behavioral pattern. Of course, if someone is neuroatypical, like someone who has Asperger's, let's say, or they're on the autism spectrum, then it becomes more arousing for them to make eye contact, and they become just like uncomfortable so that they don't make eye contact. So assuming someone is neurotypical, it's normal to look away in certain situations. So I think you're fine. It's my not clinical.
At 38, I've been assured I'm okay. What a day.
Elena, though I'm new and I don't have the right to speak because had to come in late, but I do the same thing. And sometimes I actually will say, I'm sorry if I'm going to be looking away a lot, but I go there to concentrate, because I've had a number of people where they'll actually start looking like where they're looking, because they're maybe, and also a little bit offended. And I say, I get really into it, my thoughts, and, and so that, and then That's how I communicate, you know, just like same thing if I say, okay, I know I'm a tangential thinker, but I will eventually come back around if you'll just go on the journey with me, you know, like alarm.
So Dorian, you're a talented and successful actress. How do you see, well, you've brought a lot of these things under control, right? As an actress, you're able to maintain, a lot of things, Dawn was saying about these non-conscious, body position things, as an actress, how is it you've learned to pay that fine-grained attention to every little twitch of every muscle in your face?
Well, again, I feel I came in late, so it's not fair. But when I came in, I was like, excuse me if I, but I was like, oh my God, I love this shit. Because you showed the pageant, the pretty, it's just, and I thought ever since I was little, my mother would say, Dorian, don't make those faces because we might be out. And then I would say, oh my God, that woman was so fakey. Like, because I would be like the little twitch thing, and then maybe I would be make a face like I'd be watching her like, and she'd say, Dorian, don't make those faces, because I would be responding without thinking. So I just think, I was trained, but that was only from maybe a natural thing that was coming through since I was very small. And now that I'm more mature, I can honestly say it feels more that I'll channel something. Some people might study and dissect, okay, now what is this character feeling? Then she would make that face. I'll more just like start to feel it. And then it just comes out.
Well, then it leaks out of you naturally because you start.
I'm a leaker. I guess I'm a natural leaker, and I do have. Thank you, because that's actually part of my problem. I've often thought that I'm not because of acting or other artistic things or what have you, but because of that empath thing, where I thought I'm just too porous, and I need to stop that because I'll give all of myself to people that I shouldn't be, right? It's like the idiot compassion. When I found that in Buddhism, I thought, oh my God, that's what it is. It's this porous both ways. I'll take it all in and give it all out. And, that is not, it might be sometimes a beautiful nature, but I think in the world, it's dangerous. So I love this topic from what I saw. I can't wait for the replay. I just thought, oh my God, this is,
Thank you. Jay, do you have a question?
I have a question and then I have a statement. So mine actually, I was trained the opposite. I actually can maintain eye contact for literally hours. And that's what we used to do as kids. And whoever broke away lost. And I usually won. And so I took that into the workplace, and I noticed people would kind of fidget. And my dad in high school pulled me aside and said, you make people very uncomfortable. And so I've had to train myself to look away every once in a while so that I don't maintain that contact. But I've actually found, I don't know how, but I can tell the difference between when someone is thinking and looks away and when they're not telling, or when they're deceiving, when what's coming out of their mouth is intentionally deceiving, not unintentionally, but intentionally. And I had to learn to trust that. But yeah, and I don't know how I do it, but and it's come in extremely useful in a couple of situations. Extremely useful.
Nice, trust your gut.
Yeah, that was, yeah, and usually it was I know that it comes from the full, and I love that when you said that, because one of the things you said is a body-based response. And as long as I was looking for responses only from here, then my interaction with the world was very hard. And then, but once I got more into looking at the rest of the body, what the body was, the total thing, then yeah, it's a much easier, more flowing way to be in the world and to be with others. I mean, people will tell me things that I don't want to hear, but it's important for them to say. So just FYI.
Going back to gaze, this is not interpersonal, but when students take exams, sometimes teachers think they're cheating when they're just looking up. And it seems to me sometimes when you're thinking, you need to move your eyes too. I don't know if it's related to this idea. It's just looking at the test doesn't help, but looking up, looking over really does help. And you see students doing that.
They're just lowering their cognitive load, right? So if my focus is on, this math problem, this equation, I need to look away, think about it, and go back. But yeah, actually, we do need jerk to cheater.
Yeah.
For some people, it's more than that. Looking away during exam at a white wall helps to recreate the image of the notebook. Yep. It just appears there. So that creates problems with eye tracking software during online exams actually right now, because why are we tracking eyes if the person might be gazing away to focus, and of course it only flags them, but.
Wow. It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen this in others, or, well, hopefully not yourselves, but maybe your earlier version. Looking away as my father, which Douglas knows I bring him up quite a bit. He's my T-boy, and also, my Petri dish study as time goes on. He's 93. I notice now, I know why. He would look away. I thought it was because of me. He's imaginative, and he has to go there and thinking, ruminating, cogitating, which is true. But I also noticed he looks away so you can't get a word in.
Yeah, that's part of the turn taking, right? When I'm ready to yield the floor, I'm going to look back. But as long as I'm here and there, I can't see all your, turn request signals.
Yeah, he won't.
I'm going to remember that.
That is very good.
Yeah, he actually though won't look around. He'll be looking, and then he kind of closes his eyes, and then when he's done, he doesn't want to look really at you again. At one time I actually was crying, and I was like a test. I let myself, and he came up, and I thought he didn't even respond because he did not want to see that reaction to some of the things he was saying, right? Because he was on a, kind of a tyrannical proving the point thing or whatever. But or if it's hard, if it's an emotional thing, like he's got to say something really that has to do with his emotions, he's checking out, but he's making sure you're going to hear it.
Nice. Good observations.
What came up for people in the meditation practice? Did you become aware of anything about your own attentional processes, or how you might leak, and now you can pay better attention to that?
I've done this before. Before this meditation, I know that when I'm upset, I become more quiet because I'm normally a very chatty person, and my movements are more abrupt. And so things become noisier around me just because I'm banging the doors and putting the dishes in with force. But I realized that earlier, and so I do try to control it. But when you mentioned to think about how we know about another person, not feeling well, I realized my first thought was, I have no idea. But sometimes it's enough to walk into the room and instantly know something is off. And I never thought to think, well, what is off? Well, maybe it's the way they sit, or they sigh, or the way they type on the keyboard. And I still don't know. I have no idea. You just know. You walk in and the atmosphere is different. The air is different. Like, I like this phrase that, stress and anxiety can be cut with the knife in the room. So how do you explain why this is? And I think it really boils down to, normally in a social situation, people are kind of chatting, they're talking, and when everybody's stressed and the stress is escalating, it becomes quieter, and people talk slower, or fewer people talk. So one way, but most of the time I have no idea. I just know.
And how often is it right?
About other people?
Yeah.
Well, pretty much very often.
So isn't that interesting? You don't know what you're paying attention to, and yet you're almost always right.
Well, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. It's hard reading the social feeling in the room so well. It's tough, because then you're kind of oversensitive to what's going on, and I'm jealous of my spouse, who seems to be oblivious. And not to me, but to others. We would be at the same situation, and I would say, hey, this person didn't want to come this close to you, or this person was a little stressed, and you're like, huh? What person? Okay. So I don't know how that happens. It just happens.
Thank you.
What I found, and I think you're echoing it, Elena, is when you asked us to think of a situation where somebody read us before we read ourselves completely, and then vice versa. Both of them were very sad times. It wasn't about happiness. It was about feeling bad, feeling unhappy, feeling persecuted, feeling ready to cry, but holding it in. And I thought that was sort of interesting too, that sadness we might try to hold in more than happiness. I'm not sure. But and I'm like Elena, I don't know how it happens, or whether it was posture or not looking at people, or what it was. I know it was a student who came in, and it was like she was putting on a brave face, and I said, what's really going on? And the Kleenex come out, the tears, and she tells me a lot of stuff. But I don't know, her posture seemed different. Her voice seemed quieter, but it wasn't about something happy. I mean, happiness seems to be more, people are willing to share it, not there's, at least that was what sort of struck me. And Elena, you were talking about things are off. So a lot of it is when something is going wrong.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Well, that comes
I think
back.
that's when we pay more attention to it. When it's happy, that's kind of the expected norm. Oh, people are chattering, everything's cool. I walked in the room, it's good things. Versus you walk in the room and, oh, something is off. So I have to find a way to react to that. Be careful about what I say. Versus when it's a reception somewhere and everybody's having a glass of wine and chatting away, what can I do to make it run? I mean, so I think you're right. We perceive sadness more sharply and act carefully around it, which, Doug, you may say that is not necessarily the way to go. Why should we isolate sadness more than happiness?
Well, I think this proves the point Dr. Sweet made early on, which is that when we carry around lots of expectations, and as long as things are going as expected, we don't pay good attention. That we bring our attention to bear when something seems, as you said, off, right? So that's what is that off of? That's off of your expectation in many respects. So we'll, over the next two sessions, we're going to be exploring emotions in more detail. We're basically out of time. Dawn, do you want to say anything about what's coming up or give people homework?
I have homework. Every good teacher always has homework. So the next time we meet, we'll talk about emotion as communication. We'll talk about expectancies a little bit more. And then as far as your homework, I'm going to share my screen real quick, and then Doug, you'll be able to get this to folks, right?
Yep.
Okay. So we should be able to see my screen. And so I think one of these might be similar, to what we did in the practice, but think of a perception you recently made of someone else's behavior. In writing, describe what the person did and what your perception was, and given what you know now about the effects of physiology, I need to amend that, biology and our neuro processes on perception making, formulate at least 2 alternative perceptions that you might have made about the same behavior. And the next time you encounter someone new, slow down that interpersonal perception process by paying careful attention to what you are selecting, how you are organizing information, and how you're interpreting. So slow down that process. And I'll send a copy shortly.
Okay.
And then, yeah. Thank you for letting me join your group today. I appreciate it. I had fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was so good. I can't wait to see the replay because I came in right at a juicy time. So thank you. Nice to meet everybody. So sorry I was late.
Oh, yeah, no worries.
Well, thank you.
I don't know if you saw that quote I put in the chat, but
Yeah, say it.
Dorothy Parker.
it was just on my mind last night. I just thought that, like, don't look at me in that tone of voice.
Yes. Great quote.
Exactly right.
Well,
Like
thank you
the
all.
world.
See you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Be safe.
Yes,
Good luck.
thank you so
Thank you.
much. Awesome.